pause, go back, and re-listen. Let's get started. Before we even read the story, I want you to think about some things. In this story, the heart is going to tell us something. What can your heart tell you about your feelings, your fears, your dreams? What can our hearts tell us? Here's some important vocabulary. I just want to review a couple of these words. These are the toughest words that I found in the story, and I wanted to make sure that we went over them before we read the story together. The words I selected were acute, meaning intense or sensitive. Pulsation, rhythmical throbbing or vibrating. Audacity, a confident and daring quality often seen as rude. Vehemently, showing strong and often angry feelings and emotions. And finally, derision, criticizing or laughing at someone in a nasty way. You can also see I've included synonyms for each of these words, as well as the sentence you'll see in the text. I'm going to give you a few minutes to reread through this table and familiarize yourself with these words. All right, let's jump into the story. True, nervous, very, very dreadfully nervous. I had been and am. But why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad? Hearken, and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story. It is impossible to say how first the idea entered my brain, but once conceived, it haunted me day and night. Object, there was none. Passion, there was none. I loved the old man. He had never wronged me. He had never given me insult. For his gold I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. He had the eye of a vulture, a pale blue eye, with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold, and so by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man, and thus rid myself of the eye forever. Now this is the point. You fancy me mad. Madmen know nothing, but you should have seen me. You should have seen how wisely I proceeded, with what caution, with what foresight, with what dissimulation I went to work. I was never kinder to the old man than during the whole week before I killed him. And every night, about midnight, I turned the latch of his door and opened it, oh, so gently. And then, when I had made an opening sufficient for my head, I put in a dark lantern, all closed, that no light shone out, and then I thrust in my head. Oh, you would have laughed to see how cunningly I thrust it in. I moved it slowly, very, very slowly, so that I might not disturb the old man's sleep. It took me an hour to place my whole head within the opening, so far that I could see him as he lay upon his bed. Ha! Would a madman have been so wise as this? And then, when my head was well in the room, I undid the lantern cautiously, oh, so cautiously, for the hinges creaked. I undid it just so much that a single thin ray fell upon the vulture eye, and this I did for 7 long nights, every night, just at midnight. But I found the eye always closed, and so it was impossible to do the work, for it was not the old man who vexed me, but his evil eye. And every morning when the day broke, I went boldly into the chamber and spoke courageously to him, calling him by name in a hearty tone, and inquiring how he had passed the night. So you see, he would have been a very profound old man, indeed, to suspect that every night, just at 12, I looked in upon him while he slept. Let's pause. Here's our story so far. How many characters have been introduced? Take a minute, think about it. How many characters have been introduced? Only 2. We have a narrator and we have an old man. What does this narrator hate about the old man? There is something he can't stand. It's not his personality. It's not who he is. What does he hate about this old man? His pale blue eye. also described as a vulture eye and an evil eye. How would you describe our narrator? Think about some adjectives that you could use to describe our narrator. How about mad, or crazy, or insane? All of these are ways you would describe our narrator, but how you would describe our narrator is not how our narrator would describe himself. Does he think he's crazy? Think about it. No. Our narrator thinks he is perfectly sane. He says that he could not be a madman because he made this grand plan to kill the old man, and a madman couldn't possibly have done that. Let's keep going with our story. Upon the 8th night, I was more than usually cautious in opening the door. A watch's minute hand moves more quickly than did mine. Never before that night had I felt the extent of my own powers, of my sagacity. I could scarcely contain my feelings of triumph to think that there I was, opening the door, little by little, and he not even to dream of my secret deeds or thoughts. I fairly chuckled at the idea, and perhaps he heard me, for he moved on the bed suddenly as if startled. Now you may think that I drew back, but no. His room was black as pitch with a thick darkness, for the shutters were close-fastened through fear of robbers, and so I knew that he could not see the opening of the door, and I kept pushing on it steadily, steadily. I had my head in, and was about to open the lantern when my thumb slipped upon the tin fastening, and the old man sprang up in bed, crying out, "Who's there?" I kept quite still and said nothing. For a whole hour I did not move a muscle, and in the meantime I did not hear him lie down. He was sitting up in the bed, listening, just as I have done, night after night, hearkening to the death watches in the wall. Let's take another pause. Have you ever heard a noise in the middle of the night? Think about this. Here's this old man, he's in bed, and suddenly he hears a noise. He sits up and he yells, "Who's there?" Have you ever experienced something like that? Have you ever had something jolt you out of sleep? Maybe something that frightened you? Could you feel the hairs maybe stand up on the back of your neck or your arms? You're a little creeped out. Did you lay there silently, afraid to breathe, waiting to hear if you could hear that noise again, if you could see what was going on, if you could maybe sense what was happening? Did it take you a while to fall back to sleep? Did you go right back down? Did you lay there for a while and listen? Kind of put yourself in this old man's position. Let's continue with our story. Presently, I heard a slight groan, and I knew it was the groan of mortal terror. It was not a groan of pain or of grief. Oh no, it was the low, stifled sound that arises from the bottom of the soul when overcharged with awe. I knew the sound well. Many a night, just at midnight, when all the world slept, it has welled up from my own bosom, deepening with its dreadful echo the terrors that distracted me. I say I knew it well. I knew what the old man felt, and pitied him, although I chuckled at heart. I knew that he had been lying awake ever since the first slight noise when he had turned in the bed. His fears had been ever growing on him. He had been trying to fancy them causeless, but could not. He had been saying to himself, "It is nothing but the wind in the chimney. It is only a mouse crossing the floor," or "It is merely a cricket which has made a single chirp." Yes, he had been trying to comfort himself with these suppositions, but he had found all in vain. All in vain, because death, in approaching him, had stalked with his black shadow before him and enveloped the victim. And it was the mournful influence of the unperceived shadow that caused him to feel, although he neither saw nor heard, to feel the presence of my head within the room. When I had waited a long time, very patiently, without hearing him lie down, I resolved to open a very, very little crevice in the lantern. So I opened it. You cannot imagine how stealthily, until at last a simple, dim ray, like the thread of the spider, shot out from the crevice and fell full upon the vulture eye. It was open, wide, wide open, and I grew furious as I gazed upon it. I saw it with perfect distinctness, all a dull blue, with a hideous veil over it that chilled the very marrow in my bones, but I could see nothing else the old man's face or person, for I had directed the ray as if by instinct precisely upon the damned spot. And have I not told you that what you mistake for madness is but over-acuteness of the sense? Now, I say, there came to my ears a low, dull, quick sound, such as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I knew that sound well, too. It was the beating of the old man's heart. It increased my fury, just as the beating of a drum stimulates the soldier into courage. Let's pause for a vocabulary check. Remember what the word acute means. It means intense or sensitive. Let's reread this section together. And have I not told you that what you mistake for madness is but over-acuteness of the sense? Now, I say, there came to my ears a low, dull, quick sound, such as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I knew that sound well, too. It was the beating of the old man's heart. It increased my fury, as the beating of a drum stimulates the soldier into courage. Here's a question to think about as we move on. Do you think the narrator really heard this noise? Or was it in his head? Think about the sound, the ticking of a watch, wrapped in cotton. It would be very quiet. So does our narrator have excellent hearing? Or was this noise in his head? Let's keep reading. But even yet, I refrained and kept still. I scarcely breathed. I held the lantern motionless. I tried how steadily I could maintain the ray upon the eye. Meantime, the hellish tattoo of the heart increased. It grew quicker and quicker and louder every instant. The old man's terror must have been extreme. It grew louder, I say, louder every moment. Do you mark me well? I have told you that I am nervous. So I am. And now, at the dead hour of the night, amid the dreadful silence of that old house, so strange a noise as this excited me to uncontrollable terror. Yet, for some minutes longer, I refrained and stood still. But the beating grew louder. I thought the heart must burst. And now a new anxiety seized me. That sound would be heard by a neighbor. The old man's hour had come. Let's stop here. What is Edgar Allan Poe trying to do? He is building suspense. You know that something is going to happen, something big. Let's pause for a minute and make a prediction. What is going to happen to this old man? Do you have your prediction? What is going to happen to the old man? We're going to reread the section again together. Pay attention to the bolded portions. They'll show you exactly how Edgar Allan Poe is building the suspense. Oh, and the text is highlighted. It says read along. But even yet, I refrained and kept still. I scarcely breathed. I held the lantern motionless. I tried how steadily I could maintain the ray upon the eye. Meantime, the hellish tattoo of the heart increased. It grew quicker and louder every instant. The old man's terror must have been extreme. It grew louder, I say, louder every moment. Do you mark me well? I have told you that I am nervous. So I am. And now, at the dead hour of the night, amid the dreadful silence of that old house, so strange a noise as this excited me to uncontrollable terror. Yet, for some minutes longer, I refrained and stood still. But the beating grew louder. I thought the heart might burst. And now a new anxiety seized me. The sound would be heard by a neighbor. The old man's hour had come. With a loud yell, I threw open the lantern and leaped into the room. He shrieked once only, and in an instant I dragged him to the floor and pulled the heavy bed over him. I then smiled gaily to find the deed so far done. But for many minutes, the heart beat on with a muffled sound. This, however, did not vex me. It would not be heard through the wall. At last, it ceased. The old man was dead. I removed the bed and examined the corpse. Yes, he was stone dead. I placed my hand upon the heart and held it there many minutes. There was no pulsation. He was stone dead. His eye would trouble me no more. What just happened? Our narrator just killed the old man with his own bed. Was that your prediction? Is that what you decided was going to happen when Edgar Allan Poe was building all of the suspense and the old man's hour had come? Is that what you thought, that he would be murdered? There was a sound used that Edgar Allan Poe used to build suspense. Think about it. There was a sound that repeated itself the whole way through that last slide of the text. What was that sound? It was the beating of the old man's heart. It kept getting louder and louder and louder and louder. So what do you think our narrator needs to do next? He has killed this old man. What does he need to do next? Let's keep reading. If you still think me mad, you will think so no longer when I describe the wise precautions I took for the concealment of the body. The night waned, and I worked hastily, but in silence. First of all, I dismembered the corpse. I cut off the head and the arms and the legs. Then, I took up 3 planks from the flooring of the chamber and deposited all between the scantlings. I then replaced the board so cleverly, so cunningly, that no human eye, not even his, could have detected anything wrong. There was nothing to wash out, no stain of any kind, no blood spot, whatever. I had been too wary for that. A tub had caught all, ha, ha. When I had made an end of these labors, it was 4 o'clock, still dark as midnight. As the bell sounded the hour, there came a knocking at the street door. I went down to open it with a light heart, for what had I now to fear? There entered 3 men, who introduced themselves with perfect severity as officers of the police. A shriek had been heard by a neighbor during the night. Suspicion of foul play had been aroused. Information had been lodged at the police office, and they, the officers, had been deputed to search the premises. I smiled, for what had I to fear? I bade the gentleman welcome. The shriek, I said, was my own in a dream. The old man, I mentioned, was absent in the country. I took my visitors all over the house. I bade them search well. I led them at length to his chamber. I showed them his treasures, secure, undisturbed. In the enthusiasm of my confidence, I brought chairs into the room and desired them here to rest from their fatigues, while I myself, in the wild audacity of perfect triumph, placed my own seat upon the very spots beneath which reposed the corpse of the victim. The officers were satisfied. My manner had convinced them. I was singularly at ease. They sat, and while I answered cheerily, they chatted of familiar things. But, ere long, I felt myself getting pale and wished them gone. My head ached, and I fancied a ringing in my ears. But still they sat, and still chatted. The ringing became more distinct. It continued and became more distinct. I talked more freely to get rid of the feeling, but it continued and gained definiteness, until at length I found that the noise was not within my ears. Let's pause. We're going to look at this section. Let's reread it together. I smiled, for what had I to fear? I bade the gentleman welcome. The shriek, I said, was in my own in a dream. The old man, I mentioned, was absent in the country. I took my visitors all over the house. I bade them search well. I led them at length to his chamber. I showed them his treasures, secure, undisturbed. In the enthusiasm of my confidence, I brought chairs into the room and desired them here to rest from their fatigues, while I myself, in the wild audacity of my perfect triumph, placed my own seat upon the very spot beneath which reposed the corpse of the victim. There's a table down here that says, Poe says, and it makes me think. On this side, these are quotes taken from the text. And on this side, it's to help guide us what we think about it. Let's look at this first one. I smiled, for what had I to fear? This is our narrator talking. This makes me think that our narrator got away with the murder and is not afraid of being caught. Let's look at this next one. I bade the gentleman welcome. This makes me think that our narrator feels he has done enough to cover up the murder and is not worried. In fact, he's proud. He's almost cocky. I bade them search well. Our narrator feels so smug that he wants the police to search his house well. He really, really thinks he has gotten away with this. And this last one. While I, myself, in the wild audacity of my perfect triumph, placed my own feet upon the very spot beneath which reposed the corpse of the victim. This makes me think that our narrator feels so confident in his abilities that he is able to sit over the very spot where he put the body. How could we describe our narrator? He's proud, he's smug, he's cocky, he's confident. All of these qualities tell us that our narrator thinks he's gotten away with this. He is not worried. He does not need to be concerned. Let's keep reading. Let's read this section together. The officers were satisfied. My manner had convinced them. I was singularly at ease. They sat, and while I answered cheerily, they chatted of familiar things. But ere long, I felt myself getting pale and wished them gone. My head ached, and I fancied a ringing in my ears, but still they sat and still chatted. The ringing became more distinct. It continued and became more distinct. I talked more freely to get rid of the feeling, but it continued and gained definiteness, until at length I found that the noise was not within my ears. Let's make another prediction. What is this noise? He's talking about a ringing in his ears and a noise becoming more distinct. What is this noise? What has been the noise in the story so far? There's even a hint on your screen. And another question to think about. Where is it coming from? Our author, our narrator, says the noise was not within his ears. So where is it coming from? No doubt, I now grew very pale, but I talked more fluently and with a heightened voice. Yet the sound increased. And what could I do? It was a lull, dull, quick sound, much such a sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath, and yet the officers heard it not. I talked more quickly, more vehemently, but the noise steadily increased. I arose and argued about trifles in a high key and with violent gesticulations, but the noise steadily increased. Why would they not be gone? I paced the floor to and fro with heavy strides, as if excited to fury by the observations of the men, but the noise steadily increased. Oh God, what could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore, I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting, and it grated upon the boards. But the noise arose over all and continually increased. It grew louder, 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 and still the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. Was it possible they heard not? Almighty God, no, no, they heard, they suspected, they knew. They were making a mockery of my horror. This I thought, and this I think. But anything was better than this agony. Anything was more tolerable than this derision. I could bear those hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream or die, and now again, hark, louder, 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 louder. There is some more suspense. Again, Poe used the sound to create suspense. Something else is going to happen in the story. Poe also uses repetition to make a point. He repeats the phrase, but the noise steadily increased, but the noise steadily increased. He used it several times to show you that it's increasing, increasing. It's getting louder and louder and louder and louder. What is that noise again? Remember? The same noise that's been repeating itself through this entire text. We're going to reread this section together. Pay attention to the bolded phrases. They're going to show you how Poe is building more suspense. No doubt, I grew very pale, but I talked more fluently and with a heightened voice. Yet the sound increased, and what could I do? It was a lull, dull, quick sound, much such a sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath, and yet the officers heard it not. I talked more quickly, more vehemently, but the noise steadily increased. I arose and argued about trifles in a high key and with violent gesticulations, but the noise steadily increased. Why would they not be gone? I paced the floor to and fro with heavy strides, as if excited to fury by the observations of the men. But the noise steadily increased. Oh, God, what could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore. I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting, and it grated upon the boards. But the noise arose over all and continually increased. It grew louder, 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 and still the men chatted pleasantly, and they smiled. Was it possible they heard not? Almighty God, no, no. They heard, they suspected, they knew. They were making a mockery of my horror. This I thought, and this I think. But anything was better than this agony. Anything was more tolerable than this derision. I could bear those hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream or die. And now, again, hark, louder, 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 louder. Villains, I shrieked, dissemble no more. I admit the deed. Tear up the planks. Here, here. It is the beating of his hideous heart. That was the end of our story. What happened? Did our narrator get away with it? No. He ended up confessing to the crime. Think about this. Why did he confess? Did the police suspect anything? Nope. They were sitting there talking. Was there any evidence pointing to his crime? No, he took great care to disassemble the body and make sure that there were no bloodstains. He hid it under the floorboards. There was nothing to point to the murder. So, why did our narrator confess? The sound of the heart was making him feel so guilty he had no choice. He had to confess to the crime to stop the guilt, to stop the beating of the heart. One final thought. Was the narrator insane before he murdered the old man? Or did his guilt from the murder drive him to insanity? What do you think? Was he insane before he murdered the old man? Or did his guilt from the murder drive him to insanity?